I have said it before, but I think health psychology is one of the coolest areas of the future for psychologists to pursue. But I've said that for 10 years, and I'm curious how the field has sort of caught up. I wrote a book about this in 2019, so it's been like 6 years for myself. I think it was 2019. It may have come out in 2020, but you can look that up, existential health psychology. And I looked at how um, creative psychologists could infiltrate hospitals in a way that helps physicians and practitioners, medical practitioners, do something that they haven't been trained to, but psychologists have been trained to. So take a look there, and I may talk more about that if one of the slides provokes me to do so. So chapter 14, stress, lifestyle, and health. I hear the concept stress talked about a lot by students, but oftentimes what they mean by stress is anxiety. So they say something causes them stress, and stress is this unpleasant feeling. But of course, stress is a physiological concept. It has to do with a change to your autonomic nervous system. And that change it can feel good or it can feel bad. Anxiety would be one example of that, but all stresses are not the same, but all of them have the same kind of impact to the autonomic nervous system. So we'll look a little bit at what stress is as a psychological concept, and some of the consequences of it. I suspect that's how this will be organized. So what is stress? Stress is anything that impacts your physiology. It asks something of you, and so the body has to change to adapt to that stimulus. So, for example, if I were to go outside right now, it's a sunny day, it's gorgeous out, but it's like 98 degrees and humid, and there's a little breeze, so the breeze is nice. But just being outside, my body would start to perspire in order to cool itself. So being in the sun and the heat and the humidity would be a stressor on my body. Even if the setting is beautiful and I can look out over the marsh and see the water, and see the trees on the far side there, even though I enjoy that and I look forward to doing it, it's still a stressor to me. Just as talking into this microphone and looking at the camera, that's a stressor too. It'd be much more comfortable to just sit and maybe read, and that would be very low stress on my body. So most of your day you have all sorts of stressors. Some are asking more of your body than others, but each time a stressing stimulus is introduced, the body must respond to it and adapt to it. And so that stimulus is stressing the body. So notice here it looks like these are two definitions of stress that are insufficient. So the stimulus-based definition, so I have a job that's stressful. Oh, the job is causing me stress. Or my environment. Oh, so here's the definition I gave. Physiological response the physiological response to a threat. That's the definition I just gave. And so it looks like the definition I gave was incomplete. Of course, the stimulus-based definition is incomplete, but the response-based definition is also incomplete. So this is new to me. We'll see how the textbook editors develop this. So looks like we have, if you remember the emotion chapter, there was the Schachter-Singer cognitive appraisal approach to understanding how emotion occurs. So it sounds like we have an environmental change or some stimulus in the environment that causes a change to our body, and then a cognitive appraisal that interprets that change as good or bad. So if I went outside and I thought, oh, it's so hot, it's uncomfortable, my appraisal would be that the heat stimulus and my body's response to it is bad. I need to avoid it, I need to be cooler. Therefore, I would perceive the heat as something to avoid. It'd be a threat to my physiological homeostasis. But if I perceive that as a challenge, something to overcome, something that will make me better, make me stronger. So, for example, if I was training to run the Badwater Ultramarathon, which is run in the hottest desert in the United States, then going outside when it's hot, only a paltry 98 degrees and humid would just be this tiny little stimulus, no big deal, but it would help me get stronger. So that appraisal would be an important part of interpreting the stressor of the heat. So something is less stressful if we believe we can do something about it, or it's better if we see it as a challenge. So here we've got the flow chart of what I just described. And I almost spilled coffee down my shirt. So stress is likely to result if a stressor is perceived as threatening and there are few or no effective coping options available. So in terms of mediating against a stressor, we can imagine an important step will be learning how to appraise the stressor as good or bad, seeing it as a challenge to be overcome, and then recognizing pathways out of that stressor or working with the stressor. Now, I mentioned earlier that the physiological response, so let's ignore the appraisal for now, but the physiological response is simply a shift in parasympathetic to sympathetic nervous system activity. I'm sure there'll be more on that later. But the shift from parasympathetic to sympathetic can be something that's beneficial and then something that's bad. And so, who did this? I feel like the eustress and distress came from somebody else, but the title here, the authors here, Everly and Lading, are being cited here for the distress and eustress, the distinction in this bell curve. So the eustress is good stress. So that means that the stress level isn't so high that performance goes down, but it's high in an optimal way. So again, think of preparing for a race, like you're going to run a 100-meter dash. If you have no stress arousal, no level of like anxiety, then the performance isn't going to be very high. Like you need to have a certain amount, but it can get so bad that your performance starts to decline. It's like you're so amped up that like you're so, I don't know, maybe on edge or anxious that your performance suffers. So there's an optimal combination of or a stress level that if it goes much higher than that, the performance will decline, but if it goes lower than that, performance will decline as well. All right, so let's take a look at stress levels over the last 5 years, and this is going back 12 years. So this was data taken in 2013. So has stress been going up? It looks like for about a little under half, stress has increased. For about 30%, it stayed the same, and for about 25%, it has decreased. So generally, it seems like stress levels have increased. So what's happening when you are stressed? So there is the autonomic nervous system shifting in sympathetic activity, so that's accelerated heart rate, propensity for headaches, gastrointestinal problems, sweating, things like that. The cognitive change has to do with difficulty focusing, making decisions, maybe feeling urgency but unable to do anything about it. And then behaviorally, like what you do is often escapism activities, so like maybe drinking or smoking marijuana or smoking nicotine, and then taking actions directed at avoiding or getting rid of whatever it is that you perceive as causing the stress. So we can see, these are ways that we can see stress happening. All right, so that was all just stress. Now, health psychology more broadly, of course, stress is going to be an important factor, and I imagine we'll see more about it in this slideshow. But health psychology looks at the connection between stress and illness, how life changes affect someone's well-being and quality of life, how effective behavioral interventions are. And so like smoking, we know that there's a relationship between smoking and cardiac disease and some cancers. So getting someone to stop smoking is incredibly important, but it's also very difficult to do. That's a huge behavioral change. People often design parts of their lives around the smoking habit and the ritual. So getting someone to stop is difficult, and that's something that health psychologists work on. Health psychology surveys look at stress levels in different people, health problems associated with those stress levels, behavioral properties that lead to health problems. It looks like women tend to have higher stress than men. Stress is higher in those who were unemployed, had lower education and lower income. And retirees have the lowest levels of stress. In the late aughts, the greatest increase in stress levels occurred among men, white people, and then those aged between 45 and 65, college graduates, and those with full-time employment. Interesting, especially given the national survey findings. Oh, and that period was because of the economic collapse, the housing bubble popping. So here are some sex, age, race, education, employment, and income statistics. So you can look at stress levels with respect to how much money people make, how old they are, what their race is. So have some fun taking a look at that. Maybe see where you land on each of those curves. And some more demographics. Let's see what the difference is there. So those are the average stress level scores among demographic groups between 83, 06, and 09. This one is 83, 06, and 09. So maybe just, I think they're the same curves. Yeah, they're the same curves. So there they are, just bigger. All right, so here, I think this is the guy I was thinking of. Walter Cannon was the first person to describe the body's physiological reaction to stress. And if you remember, maybe we'll see a picture of the brain. Maybe it's coming up, but it's a little P-shaped hypothalamus underneath in the limbic system underneath the midbrain, or the lower part of the midbrain. And that is responsible for the hormone systems, and it initiates what's called the fight or flight response. I'm sure you've heard that before. I'm either going to fight you because you're a threat, I'm going to flee from you because you're a threat, or I'm going to freeze so you don't see me because you're a threat. So all of these are the physiological arousal goes up systems or mechanisms in your body. You start sweating, you look for the exit, or you are unable to focus on like solving a problem. You're looking elsewhere, looking for the exit. Your heart rate increases, blood pressure increases. Usually blood flows to the extremities so you can run or you can fight. And so all of these things are happening in response to stress. So imagine like giving a public speech. Your heart starts racing, your palms get sweaty, or you have trouble like, I forget how am I supposed to start? What was my opening? And you start to feel a little uneasy. Maybe you get nauseous. All of these things are part of the autonomic nervous system shifting from parasympathetic to sympathetic. So that is the nervous system response. And there are evolutionary reasons for us developing that. Otherwise, if a predator found us and we didn't have that natural instinct click on, and our body's already prepared to either defend ourselves or run for it, it would take us a while to like kind of gear up and defend ourselves. So here are some more of those. Respiration quickens. I didn't say that. Muscles tense. Pupils dilate. Hans Selye is the name that I was thinking of. So he is credited for the general adaptation syndrome. And so his stress research noticed that a prolonged exposure to stress showed signs of adrenal enlargement. So again, the hypothalamus is responsible for releasing hormones. So the adrenal system is connected to the hypothalamus. So the same pattern of physiological reactions occurred regardless of the stressor. So it doesn't matter if it's something I'm afraid of or something I'm excited about. It's the same physiological process. So the 3 stages are alarm, resistance, and then if that persists, exhaustion. So your body is very resilient, and you can maintain a high level of stress for months, but eventually your body will no longer be able to cope. And so you'll start to see systems shutting down because you don't have energy to support them anymore if you have this high level of arousal caused by stressors in your life. At some point, something has to give. It might just be you have an exam, and because you have an exam, you can't clean your house or you can't spend time with your friends, so there's just too many stressors, and so you have to cut one of those out. But eventually, if you're not cutting out stressful stimuli in your environment, then there are systems, energetic systems in your body that will have to start shutting down. And eventually, like, you won't be able to sleep. You'll have this heightened state of arousal all the time. You'll start to maybe lose weight or gain weight depending on which system is shutting out. Your immune system will falter. So that's the link between stress and immune response. So you're more likely to get sick, or you'll get sick for a longer period. And then some other autoimmune disorders can start to emerge. Cancers, diabetes, and other like cardiac disease issues. So here is a physiological curve of what happens when a stressor is introduced. So there's this initial period of alarm where there's a decrease in arousal, and then it goes up until it can't go up anymore, and then eventually starts to tail out. So I mentioned earlier the relationship between the hypothalamus and the adrenal glands. And so the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are right next to each other, and those together control the adrenal system. The adrenal glands, of course, are responsible for adrenaline, but also things like testosterone and aldosterone, and other cortisol. So here's the stress hormone. So if you feel like amped up, like, oh, I can't relax, that's usually cortisol being released. And so that's part of the HPA axis. It just means your body is responding to stress. And so if you're feeling amped all the time, then there's probably some stressors in your life that either need to be reevaluated or removed or just managed a little bit better. So we mentioned earlier, like, changes in the environment can initiate the stress response, but what are some of the examples of those stressors? A crappy job, a bad boss, difficulty in a relationship, maybe a bad test grade. All of these can be potential stressors, or it could be a singular acute traumatic life event. So a chronic stressor is something that you live with. It's all the time. It's ongoing. So it could be a bad relationship, a relationship that tears you down or asks a lot of you. It could even be a good relationship, like maybe a parent-to-child relationship, but still one that's very demanding. An acute stressor is something that happens in a brief period of time. So last night, one of our neighbors lost their dogs, so they got loose, and so it was like, oh, we got to go find these dogs before nightfall because there are a lot of predators out in the country where we live. So we had to drop everything we were doing and go help look for these dogs. And so that was a singular acute stressor that once we found the dogs, and thankfully we did, the stressor was gone, and we could our nervous systems could settle back down. So that's a singular acute stressor. But a chronic stressor might be someone in your family who has maybe a cardiac condition, and their condition is declining. So this relationship of yours is starting to be impaired, and so, like, now you're worried about them. You have to go see them, and so that's over a longer period. That would be a chronic stressor. So there's a list of some acute stressors and traumatic events. About, it looks like 60 years ago, Holmes and Rahe proposed a way of measuring stress, and they looked at changes to your environment and came up with a list of significant life changes. And the idea there was some events are standardizable in terms of how stressful they are. So think of, like, Starting a new job, like that's stressful. It's also exciting, but it's stressful. There's a lot of things you need to learn about and do. A new relationship, a new partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, spouse. Um, these things are stressful. Losing a loved one is stressful. Gaining a new sibling or child, that's stressful. Um, Going to prison, that's stressful. So they came up with a list of all of these things, numbering them from 11 to 100 in terms of how big your life changes in response. But the whole idea there was that stress is caused by a change in your environment that you have to adapt to. So the stress is literally that adaptation. So this is a physiological change definition of stress. Um, and if you can count up all those stressors, you can get a objective quantification of how stressed you are. So there's the social readjustment rating scale. There's also one for children, and I think there's one for college students, which I've shared with my health psychology students. Um, I'm not a huge fan of them. I don't particularly think they're very insightful, but it was the way stress was measured for a long time. We can also look at stress, and this is the way stress is normally talked about, just these daily hassles. Um, I've had a stressful day. It's like I've had a lot of these really crappy things happen. So there's a traffic jam, or I got in a car accident, my car wouldn't start. Um, I ran out of peanut butter, couldn't make a sandwich, or um, my girlfriend broke up with me. I got a bad grade. All of these little things might happen, and each little one might impart a little stressor, but as they add up, it can add up into something pretty big. So that's like one model way of looking at stress. So these aren't huge life changes. These are just daily like hassles. That's probably a way that you're more familiar with thinking about stress. Other stressors, it could just be the job that you have. And we talked about that in IO psychology, so I won't go into that. The type of relationship you have with close friends, family, and romantic partners, they can impart good or bad stress. And there are different factors to consider in evaluating those stress levels. And then, of course, because health psychologists are interested in how all of this impacts health and well-being, we can look at the relationship between stress and illness. So, psychophysiological disorders are disorders for which there are psychological components and bodily components. So, like if it's stress related, then you have the evaluation of the stress, the HPA axis, which then causes your body to respond. So, of course, there's going to be a cognitive appraisal part of that or a psychological part of that, and then the bodily part of that. And if it's a chronic stressor, then it may lead to all sorts of physical or physiological disorders and diseases and illnesses. So some of those common ones are regular headaches, asthma, so that would be your sinus passage, like inflammation in the sinus passage, acne or outbreaks in your skin, eczema, another outbreak, hypertension, cardiac disease, IBS or like discomfort in your bowels, and then coronary heart disease. I think that has to do with cholesterol in your arteries. So all of those things are related to stress and the psychological evaluation of the stressors and your response to them. So stress can in fact impact your cardiovascular system, which is pretty surprising. So part of health is having a positive view of your life and the things in your life and having a positive appraisal of them or making appropriate changes and pruning if necessary. Of course, the immune system is involved with that heightened level of arousal. We talked about after a while, something's got to give. With high levels of stress, the immune system will decrease. It's been well documented in college students that during exam time, like midterms or end of term exams, students are more likely to get sick. And so it was believed for a while that maybe it's because they're studying together and the germ exposure. But what they found was that the immune system, if they actually looked at white blood cells, killer T cells, the immune systems are impaired during periods of high stress, even if it's related to something non-health related, such as studying for an exam or being stressed out about grades. Psychoneuroimmunologists look at the relationship between these thought processes we've been talking about and the immune system as mediated by the HPA axis. And so that's called psychoneuroimmunology, a very fascinating area of research. Okay, I mentioned the relationship between stress and immune disorder, so you can read about some of the results of studies there, as well as how stress changes with age. Okay, the more stress you experience, the faster you'll age, and that's been studied by the telomeres on neurons. So telomeres are what allow DNA to replicate. So every cell has a lifespan, and it's shorter than your lifespan. And so our bodies completely rebuild like every few years. Every cell in your body like dies and is reproduced. And if a cell, the telomeres of a cell become shorter, then the DNA is less likely to replicate, and eventually it stops replicating, which is why skin starts to sag. It's like some of those cells didn't replicate, and so age starts to be visible when telomeres get smaller and smaller because those cells aren't replicating, and eventually organ systems shut down because the process can't continue. And so in terms of the number of stressful adversities experienced, the length of telomeres gets smaller. So look at that. Zero. How do they define? Okay, a traumatic life experience. I don't see how traumatic life experience was defined, but the graph shows that telomeres are shorter in adults who experienced more trauma as children, and that was just that's 0 traumatic experiences as a child, 1, and then more than 1, and this is the length of their telomeres as adults. We don't see a whole lot of the design characteristics here, so how many people were involved, how old they were, average ages, and so on, but there's definitely a relationship between traumatic experiences and telomere length, and that's helpful for understanding how quickly someone ages. I mentioned already the relationship between stress and heart disease, including hypertension. Down here we have some psychological disorders, mood disorder related, called negative affect, and so that's also one of the consequences of high levels of stress. Here's some symptoms of a heart attack. Seems kind of irrelevant for a psychology textbook, but of course, if cardiac disease is a consequence of high levels of stress, then I guess you'd want to be able to recognize when they're happening. It looks like maybe there's a different symptomology for males versus females. So we'll take a look at those. Type A and Type B personalities. Type A, I've read that these are a little overgeneralized. So it's not so clear cut, the relationship between Type A and Type B, but generally, as like a general statement, Type A people are intensely driven, they're highly organized, they're impatient, they're always in a rush, they might be competitive or hostile with others, they tend to be extremely high achievers as well, and that Type B are like laid back, relaxed, chill, no big deal, not competitive, like let's work together, let's only do as much as is necessary, we're all winners here. So Type A people, again, these are overgeneralizations. Type A people are more likely to have heart attacks than Type B people. But I'm pretty sure subsequent or more recent research has shown that it's way more complicated than that. But the Type A, Type B distinction has been talked about for a very long time, and it's part of common parlance now. So it's worth knowing what someone means when they say Type A or Type B. Type A, high strung. Type B, chill. Type A, more likely to have heart disease. Type B, higher levels of health and well-being. Transactional model of hostility for predicting social interactions. Interesting. So being hostile and angry with others, or confrontational, has negative health effects. I didn't realize that. And so, and if you're like that, it increases other people's hostility to you. And I've looked at that psychologically, in transactional analysis, I've got a book on that. I've never thought about its impact on health and cardiovascular disease, but it doesn't surprise me that there'd be a relationship there. Depression and heart disease. So this is heart attacks per 100, and then depression score. So men who are depressed are more likely to, it looks like men are more likely to have heart attacks just in general. And then the more heart attacks, no, the higher your depression level, the more heart attacks you're likely to have, or the more likely you are to have a heart attack. So there's a positive correlation between depression and heart attacks. And men are more likely than women to have heart attacks. All right. And so maybe that's because of how people solve their depression with medication, using cigarettes or marijuana or alcohol. Asthma. What are the psychological factors responsible for asthma? They have higher level of negative emotions, high levels of emotions, exposure to stressful experiences. Control of inflammation is a big part of the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And so if it's busy working on other stressful responses, it can't also mediate inflammation. And so inflammation in the sinuses could be a consequence of that. And so there's a relationship between stress and asthma. And of course, like negative emotions, high levels of emotions would be part of that system. And so here is what that looks like in the lungs. So let's say you have stress. How do you cope with it? So there's two types of coping. One is problem-focused coping, and then the other is emotion-focused coping. And I'm unfamiliar with these designations, so let's look at them. Problem-focused coping is when individual attempts to manage or alter the problem that is causing them to experience stress. So it's a appraisal. Why am I feeling stressed? Let's figure this out. Let's solve that problem. Maybe recognizing it inside myself or outside of myself. It's a very, it's likely to be used if you feel like it's something that can be controlled, and it recognizes that you can be responsible for controlling it. And so that's a proactive measure. So that's, I imagine that would be the more effective approach. Now, emotion-focused coping is another approach, and that's when you just kind of focus on what is the stress causing in my life, and let's eliminate the consequence. So if you're stressed out and you can't sleep, rather than figure out what's stressing me out, what is the problem here, and solve it, you might just say, all right, well, I'm going to start taking a sleeping pill. And now I can sleep, no big deal. But eventually, like, you're not solving the stressor, and you're going to become dependent on sleeping pills. So you're pretty much stuck if the solution stops working because you haven't really solved the problem yet. It'd be nice to see the outcomes of those two. It'd be helpful to, I suspect the problem-focused coping is better since you're getting the actual root of the problem. But emotion-focused coping is a lot more common. So it'd be nice to see the outcome effects. Let's see, control and stress. If we feel like we're in control, so we use problem-focused coping, then we have higher levels of health and happiness, better physical and mental health, greater psychological well-being, lower reactivity to stress in daily life. So I guess there are some of the outcomes. It's not linked directly to the previous slide, but I'm making that link for you. One of my favorite experiments was Seligman's learned helplessness studies, and just really briefly, they weren't gorgeous. I don't know that they were gorgeous, adorable beagles, but dogs were put in these on these tables that would shock them. So there's like the side with coils that will shock the dogs, and the dogs had to get out of the way. And if they jumped over here, they wouldn't be shocked. And so what they were trying to do was actually study emotion by torturing these dogs. It's horrible. But what Seligman realized is if dogs were shocked and didn't have any way of getting out of the way, so they were powerless to solve the problem, they couldn't control the situation, they would eventually give up. So they learned, and that's not normal. Dogs will try to avoid being shocked if they can. But eventually the dogs would give up so that they would stop trying to avoid it. And so they learned to be helpless. And this has been studied in like educational settings. If someone tries really hard to learn physics, but whatever they do, they fail and no one's really helping them, they eventually give up. And then it's like they don't care anymore, but really they've been taught not to care. So they need someone to help them rediscover this ability to take control, and it takes a very long time. So Seligman actually went from this learned helplessness study to positive psychology, how to promote this sort of purpose-driven control-taking of one's life, positive thinking, trying to actualize one's potential, see what one can become, and it's become a very popular approach in clinical psychology. We saw in the motivation chapter that social support is really important for promoting and maintaining behaviors and quality of life and well-being. So of course there's going to be an impact of having social support on your own health and quality of life and health outcomes, medical outcomes. So being in socially supportive environments, and this happens, and this works even if you just believe that people support you, will boost your immune system and reduce blood pressure. So it's a huge factor in your health. We know it's a huge factor in your psychology, but it's a huge factor in your medical health as well. So building relationships, quality relationships, supportive relationships can help all of your medical test scores. So again, let's say you have stress. What's the best way to deal with it? Well, exercise is a stressor, but it can reduce your daily stress levels. So the exercise itself will raise your stress while you're exercising, but when you're not exercising, your stress levels will be lower, and part of that's because you're choosing where to focus that energy, and it's not being focused on things that are maybe superfluous or unnecessary. It's just focused on an activity that you have control over, that you enjoy, you see it as a challenge, and so you're less likely to have that stress arousal response to maybe activities or stimuli in your environment that shouldn't stress you out, and therefore they don't. You can also meditate. There's biofeedback that's using like a heart rate monitor or a HRV monitor to see as an external sign of what's going on internally. So that's biofeedback. It's your biology, something that you can see and that can change your appraisal and your focus, and then you can actually recognize the relationship between your mindset and your body. Some pretty cool technology out there now, even wearable devices. And then hopefully this is the final little set of slides. Health psychologists look at the relationship between happiness, positivity, and something called flow, and health and well-being. So happiness isn't just I've got a smile on my face or I'm laughing. It's having a life you enjoy, skills that you value and are proud of, and you feel like you're making a difference. All of those things can contribute to happiness, and none of them is having fun, except maybe like pleasant life. It's easy to define happiness as a pleasant life, but if it's not supported by the other ones, it won't last, or it won't really be. It'll seem superficial after a while. I've read pretty good criticisms about studying happiness of people in every country because it hides some of the other maybe problems and inequalities. But we've actually measured happiness levels of different countries, and I think there's a graph. No, you can look up happiness graphs by nation, and you can see where U.S. lies and where like other countries lie. But Denmark is reportedly the happiest, and Americans are 17th. What else contributes to happiness? I'll let you look at that because I'm getting tired. Life events and happiness. So things that can occur in your life that improves happiness, and things that you would expect to improve happiness but don't actually improve your happiness. The relationship between big life events and happiness. Some of them are maybe surprising or unexpected. Positive psychology. I mentioned Martin Seligman earlier. So this is what he designed was positive psychology, and he looked at ways to increase all of these things. These are he would define as like things that improve one's psychology rather than going in the reverse, which would be like having a disorder. He wanted people to be like above average, optimally have optimal psychology. And so you can look up positive psychology techniques to boost any one of these factors. And a lot of them are counterintuitive. You wouldn't think it would work so well, but they really do. Seligman's big book about positive psychology was called Learned Optimism, and recognizing that you can actually develop a more optimistic outlook by changing the way you think and appraise life experiences, and it has all sorts of health and psychological benefits. Flow is so named by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, is this period you have where you're like engrossed in an activity, maybe playing video games or reading or working on an art project, and you lose track of time. You kind of feel at one with whatever you're doing, or maybe it's like having sex. Like you lose yourself and the other in like the activity, and you're in the state of flow. And the state of flow has positive health and psychological benefits, and it's also a pretty good indication that you're doing something that you're called to do, or like that is natural or normal for you, and it has this restorative quality to it. I was hoping that would be the end of it, and it is. So that is health psychology in a very brief nutshell.